Kara, thank you so much for joining me. I am really excited to get your perspective on this executive order. First, I kind of want to back up and just start with the basics, the fundamentals of what to a lot of people is a crazy and confusing conversation. When this executive order talks about not being able to discriminate on gender identity, what does that phrase even mean?
It's a great question, and thank you so much for having me. You know, Unfortunately, our society seems to have adopted the notion that there is such a thing as gender identity and
Right.
that it merits protection in the law. So I would say two things. One, I would say that really gender identity doesn't mean much of anything. When you really dig down into the particulars, it's a made up ideology that has no grounding in material reality whatsoever. It is fundamentally anti science, and it really doesn't merit being protected in civil rights law. Now, to the extent that so called gender identity means anything, what it means from a feminist perspective, which is where I come from, gender, as far as we're concerned, is a caste system. Gender is a set of sex based stereotypes, which we're all really familiar with. It's the notion that girls are supposed to like pink and boys are supposed to like blue, that men are innately aggressive and women are innately nurturing. And these are sex based stereotypes that feminists have been fighting for centuries to destroy. And to the extent that gender identity means anything at all, it means a person chooses to adopt or identify with the sex based stereotypes of the opposite sex. And from a feminist perspective, that's extremely harmful because we don't want those sex based stereotypes to exist at all. From our perspective, if a man wants to wear a pink outfit, he ought to be able to do that. If a woman wants to wear pants and become an attorney or a CEO, she ought to be able to do that. We want to get rid of sex based stereotypes. And to the extent that so called gender identity ideology exists, it would enshrine those sex based stereotypes in society. And what President Biden's order does is enshrine them in the law. And we think that that is horrible for women and girls. But even going back, really at its core, when you really examine it, gender identity doesn't mean anything. It is not grounded in material reality and is anti science.
Right. And we would acknowledge that an anomaly like intersex obviously exists. Something like gender dysphoria actually exists. I mean, these are diagnoses that really exist, people feeling uncomfortable in their bodies. But what you are saying is that this idea that we are just able to declare what gender we are independent of our sex, it has no basis in reality and therefore should have no holding in our law, correct?
Yeah, and it's important to bring up the real topic of intersex. It is true that there are people with what is commonly referred to as intersex, is sometimes referred to as disorders of sexual development or differences of sexual development. And what that means is that there are some people, a very small minority of people, who have chromosomal anomalies, right? Women have XX chromosomes, men have XY chromosomes, and there are some people who have different chromosomal makeups. It's a very tiny minority of the population. And from what I understand of the science, I'm not a scientist, but I have read a lot about this and spoken with scientists and doctors. If anybody has a Y chromosome, that person is still male because the Y chromosome triggers a certain gene that develops into male a male
Right.
body,
Right.
right? So what you're referring to as intersex is real, certainly. And yes, my understanding is that there are people who are uncomfortable in their bodies. But I also just want to say there's nothing unusual about being uncomfortable in our bodies. Uh, Most people struggle a bit with puberty, especially girls. And there's nothing unusual or strange about one being uncomfortable in one's body, but that doesn't make a person actually the opposite sex.
Which is one of the dangers, and especially when it comes to this movement as it pertains to children, is that a child who expresses any discomfort in their body or any discomfort with, like you said, gender stereotypes, maybe a girl who wants to, only wear pants and not wear dresses. That was me when I was younger. I never wanted to wear a dress. I wanted to wear a white t-shirt and jeans. I liked bugs and snakes, and I just wasn't into the frilly stuff. Nowadays, that is almost seen as, well, is that young girl confused about her gender? Is she confused about her identity? Should we talk to a psychologist? Should we perhaps use cross-sex hormones in order to suppress puberty or to delay puberty so we can talk about who she really is? I mean, it's kind of scary to think about that there are a lot of kids, there are a lot of girls and boys who have different interests and don't fit maybe the typical gender stereotype that has been constructed that you talked about in the beginning, who now are being told, even sometimes by pediatricians and psychologists and parents, well, that must mean that your body is wrong. That must mean that your biology is wrong. And to me, that just seems like it would be so damaging for adolescents who don't really have gender dysphoria, but are almost being pressured into changing their bodies just because they don't fit this narrow definition of what it means to be a boy or a girl, right?
Yes, and you're right to say it's very scary. It is extremely scary, and I think that a lot of people are really underinformed about what is really going on here. And what is going on here is that you're absolutely right. Children in schools are being told that if they're uncomfortable in their body, then perhaps they are the opposite sex. And parents are not getting the information that they need to really navigate this very difficult situation. Mm-hmm. It is scarier than most people understand. We are dealing with a situation in which children, as you say, are getting puberty blockers at alarmingly young ages. And we do not know the long-term effects of puberty blockers on otherwise healthy children.
Right.
It's worth understanding that puberty blockers were created and first administered for people who have what is referred to as precocious puberty. These are kids who just start puberty early, and their medical professionals feel like they're starting puberty at an age where they're not psychologically prepared to handle those kinds of changes. So doctors will halt the process of puberty until the kids are at an age and at a psychological level of development where they're in line with their peers and they're psychologically prepared to handle it. Nobody's disputing the validity of that. The problem here is that we're talking about children who are otherwise normal, we would say, sort of developmentally, and they're being given puberty blockers, and we do not know the long-term effects of this. One thing that we do know is that the overwhelming majority of children who are given puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormones, and this results in some serious health effects. We know that this is more likely to cause cancer in children and young adults, and we know that it causes permanent sterility. Mm-hmm. And this is happening in children who are not prepared to make the kinds of decisions that our society is pressuring them, as you said, to make. And there's some of your viewers may not know, there's been a really helpful development in the UK in a case involving a young woman named Kara Bell. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She's in the UK, and she was given puberty blockers at a very young age, went on to take cross-sex hormones, then turned out to regret all of that and sued the gender identity clinic that she was sent to, and she won her case. And a court in the UK has now ruled that children under 16 cannot legally consent to these kinds of medical interventions. And that case is now on appeal. But it's a very positive development for kids in the UK.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, we understand, it's just kind of common sense that there are a lot of things that children can't consent to, that they're just not able to kind of make those long-term decisions. That's why the family is important. That's why parents are important. That's why the strength of families is important, because parents are instilled with that responsibility of good stewardship of their kids to help them and guide them to navigate these very confusing questions. And when you kind of surrender that responsibility that you have as a parent to this social experiment that says, well, let's try to change my child's biology because she doesn't want to wear a dress or something like that, or because she learned about this at school and is now confused. Like you said, it becomes very frightening. I'm encouraged by what we saw in the UK. I hope and I could see this kind of snowballing where people are at least able to say, okay, let's not make our kids a social experiment. I want to talk about how this order in particular and this movement in general has an effect not just on the kids who are getting these puberty blockers at, say, 8 to 11 years old, but also female athletes, young girls in female-only spaces, locker rooms, bathrooms. This executive order basically says if you get federal funding, you're not able to say that boys who identify as girls can't go in the girls' bathroom or run and track against girls, correct? What's the implication of all of that?
Yeah, so I want to talk about the order, but just going back to the question of parents and how frightening this is, I'm aware of cases in which parents have lost custody of their children. Children have been removed from their parents' homes in cases where the parents do not go along with the so-called affirming approach. It is impossible to state how alarming this is and how much danger we are all in, because the ideology of so-called gender identity has taken over throughout all of our social institutions, including the law, including government, including journalism, including academia. Every single institution has been completely captured by this.
And it trumps other rights too. It trumps parental rights. And obviously, it's not in the best interest of the child when you think about our foster care system. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the abuses and the neglect that goes on there. To think that taking a child from the loving home and the caring home and the attentive home of their parents, even parents who think that, okay, I'm not going to go along with this newfound gender identity, to think that that could be good for that child. I mean, it just shows you that this is ideologically driven. This is not about the well-being of these kids.
Absolutely. And, as you said earlier, it's just worth emphasizing. I come at this from a feminist perspective, and I agree with you 100% on what you just said. So maybe turning to the order, it might be helpful to go back to last June with the Supreme Court's ruling in the Bostock decision. Is that okay to maybe ground this?
Yeah,
okay.
Let's definitely do that, because this is what the executive order is based on.
So the Supreme Court last year first combined a couple of cases. It combined two cases in which gay men had been fired from their jobs because they were gay. And it combined those two cases with a case called Amy Stevens, in which a man named Amy Stevens demanded recognition by his employer to be considered to be a woman. And so the court conflated these three cases. Its ruling that the gay men should not have been fired for being gay, we would argue, is great from the perspective that it is wrong to fire someone for being gay. We are all in favor of protection of sexual orientation in employment law. But then what it did is it also ruled that it constitutes sex discrimination in the employment context to fire someone based on so-called transgender status. The Supreme Court never defined what transgender status might mean, so we don't know. The other thing that's important to note about the Bostock decision from last June is that the court was very clear that its ruling was limited to employment discrimination. Now, there were many of us at that time that said, well, that's not going to work, because for practical purposes, a lot of people are going to interpret this as applying outside of the employment context. And that is exactly what this executive order does. It says, inaccurately, that Bostock ruled that gender identity is protected. Bostock didn't actually rule that. The language that the Bostock decision used is that people are protected in employment based on transgender status, again, without defining it. And the Bostock decision limited its ruling to the employment context. One thing that this executive order does is state inaccurately that gender identity is now protected in all sorts of other contexts. It uses some tricky language. It says, under the reasoning of Bostock, the gender identity protection applies in Title IX and in other contexts. And that's just inaccurate. It's a complete misrepresentation of the Bostock decision. So Bostock happened, and our view is that Bostock was terrible for women and girls.
Mm-hmm.
Notwithstanding that, as bad as that was for women and girls, the order takes it even further.
And I just want to note
Sure.
for my audience to remember that when Bostock was decided, Justice Gorsuch, a conservative constitutionalist justice, is what swayed the decision in this direction, which a lot of conservatives were very disappointed in. So I just want to remind people that this is not just a matter of liberal versus conservative, that there was a conservative judge that was appointed by President Trump, our justice, that decided that went with the concurrence for the Bostock decision. So I just wanted to note that for everyone.
That's right. Thanks for that clarification. So I just think it's really important to understand. We talked about what gender identity is. We didn't really talk about what it isn't. One thing that gender identity, whatever it is not sexual orientation. And I think it's important that everybody really understand that all of the lesbians and gay men that I know do not want to have anything to do with this so-called gender identity movement. They just don't want to be affiliated with it because same-sex attracted people are attracted to other people on the basis of sex.
Yeah.
Opposite-sex people are attracted to people on the basis of sex. This is all grounded in material reality.
Mm-hmm.
It has nothing to do with so-called gender identity, whatever that means.
Right.
And we need to understand that it is simply not possible to protect women and girls in the law, in sports, in same-sex or in sex-segregated spaces, in prisons, in domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, homeless shelters. We cannot protect women and girls and also say that gender identity is a category of people worthy of civil rights protection. They are just not compatible.
Yeah.
So we just need to understand that if we're going to have laws and policies that protect so-called gender identity, what we are doing is obliterating women and girls as a sex-based class of people in the law.
And obviously the reason why that's important is because of something that I think a lot of transgender activists deny, and that is that there are fundamental biological differences between men and women. The reason why we raise so many concerns about biological men entering women's spaces, and we don't quite as much talk about biological women entering men's spaces and the danger of that, is because there is a potentially a physical threat, especially when you're talking about physical competition in track or something like that. There is a physical advantage that biological men have over the average woman that poses a threat to her, that can be a danger to her. And I actually talked about that once, and the response that I got from someone, which I just think is so detached from reality, but is indicative of how a lot of activists apparently think. And this person told me that that was internalized misogyny, that there's no reason why a woman wouldn't be able to beat a man in track. There's no reason why a woman wouldn't be able to defend herself in a situation in which a man entered what is supposed to be a private, exclusively female space. That's just me affirming gender stereotypes about women being the weaker sex. It's almost like we're not even allowed to talk about the biological advantages that men, even those who identify as women and, maybe taking cross-sex hormones, have over women. Why this detachment from reality?
It's not even almost as though we're not allowed to talk about it. It is exactly that we are not allowed to talk about it, but feminists will keep talking about this. And you're absolutely right. Men do retain physical advantages over women in sports. And I also just think, even if that weren't true, and it is, men retain physical advantages over women in sports, even if they're taking puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. They do. They retain physical advantages just in terms of size alone. And other things like bone density, lung capacity.
Yep.
Hormones don't change any of that.
Right.
But even if that weren't true, women need to have the right to say no to men under any circumstances for any reason or no reason at all, including in the bedroom, in our bathrooms, and on the playing field. We have to be absolutely relentless about this. Women have the right to say no to men.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's probably a point that is lost in all of this. And it also seems like there are many people who are comfortable with living in this cognitive dissonance that, for example, we can say that Kamala Harris is the first female vice president. And so we obviously acknowledge that sex is significant, that it actually means something, that it's not just her gender identity that makes this a special event or a special accomplishment. We still call people, I would say most people in society still refer to people by gendered pronouns in the gender binary of he and she and her and him. And yet when it comes to something like this executive order, when it comes to activism, we push all of that common sense away and we start embracing this dissonant, detached from reality language of, well, gender identity is this very fluid thing that has nothing to do with sex. And like you said, it also confuses things like homosexuality. I saw someone the other day call out Miley Cyrus. Miley Cyrus said, I'm attracted to women because of this part of their anatomy and it's better than this part of guys' anatomy. And,
and she used fairly crude language, characteristically of Miley Cyrus.
She did. And people were upset about that, not because, I guess, of her attraction, but because she associated certain anatomy with women and certain anatomy with men. And this person who was trying to refute her said, no. Homosexuality is really about being attracted to gender identity, not about being attracted to anatomy. And I just, like you were saying, I just don't think that's true. This all seems very unsustainable to me. Like it's just going to come to a head at some point.
One can only hope. The dissonance that you talk about is absolutely astonishing. I have been following this issue for years. And because of my feminist activism and my feminist background, I have known how devastating this all is to the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls. What I did not see coming, and what most of us did not see coming, is the speed and force with which this ideology has completely captured all of our institutions. And you're absolutely right about the dissonance. So for just another example, also yesterday, Keira Knightley, the actress from the UK, announced that she will no longer be filmed doing sex scenes that are directed by men. And the thing of it is, this has nothing to do with so-called gender identity. This is just her making a statement about what she is and is not willing to do on camera.
Right.
And every single person who read that story knows exactly what she means.
Yeah.
She knows, we all know that she is a woman, and we all know what she means by a sex scene, and we all know what she means by sex scenes directed by men. Mm-hmm. When we have conversations like this, normally, when we're not talking about so-called gender identity, everybody knows what a woman is, and everybody knows what a man is. But all of a sudden, when the phrase gender identity comes onto the scene, people act like they're all of a sudden confused. But in reality, no one's really confused. It's just the dissonance. It's the dissonance that you're talking about, which is just astonishing.
It's forced confusion, which I think a good portion of the sexual revolution, at least from my conservative perspective, is a lot of forced confusion. And it's damaging, like you said, not just to individuals, not just to people's safety and privacy, but also to families, to children, to people's minds. Something that has really been settled science for as long as humans have been around is now being called into question. And we're already seeing the damaging societal ramifications for that. And what I hope is that, I always say that truth is like a beach ball. You can try to push it under the water, but eventually it's going to pop back up. To me, this is such an irrefutable reality, the reality of male and female, that the beach ball is going to pop back up one way or another. It's just a matter of how much damage is going to be caused in the process. Do you agree?
I completely agree. I think that you and I could probably have a very interesting conversation about what is meant by the sexual revolution. And I'm sure that you and I probably disagree about a lot of things that's entailed in that. And that's fine. I'm happy to talk with people who disagree with me on a lot of things. Um, but I guess I just want to say that what feminists were doing during the second wave of feminism in the 1960s and 1970s was not about denying the category of women. You and I might disagree about a lot of things about second wave feminism, and that's okay. But one thing we have to be very clear on is that feminists never tried to suggest that women don't exist. It's the exact opposite of that. And now it's all just been perverted.
Yeah, I think my argument would be when it would be around like what women were purportedly liberated from. And I think that trying to minimize harmful gender stereotypes is good, and obviously affirming people's sex, even if they don't fit into narrow categories, is really good. I think I take issue with the parts of feminism that say, well, women need to be able to be exactly like men, and we need to get away with this idea that women are more nurturing, or women tend to like these things, when in general, a lot of those descriptors are true. And when we try to tell women, no, you can be like this and you can be exactly like a man, to me, it's almost inevitable that it leads to kind of the confusion that we're seeing right now, that, okay, if we get rid of all unique descriptors of men and women, then there's going to be a whole lot of confusion. So I'm not saying I have the answer to the balance of that, but I can also see how the logic of feminism has led to where we are right now.
I mean, I can understand the argument that you're making, and I would disagree with it because I don't think that feminism was saying that. It also becomes a little bit difficult because there are different kinds of feminism, and we have to get into labels of this type versus that type and all sorts of things that I don't think we have time for. So I think that what we're talking about right now actually leads to a really interesting conversation about how in our society today people can talk with one another, right? Like, I heard what you just said, and I can understand your argument and disagree with it, and I don't hate you.
That's good. I definitely don't hate you either. Yes.
I feel like there are a lot of ways in which our society has lost the ability to have decent conversations with people with whom we might disagree. And, we might change each other's minds. I don't know. I'm open to that possibility. I would welcome more conversations like this. But when it comes to the topic of gender identity, people who push back against it are generally shut down. Yeah. I think you mentioned my Tucker Carlson appearance. I related a story to him about how about a year ago, I and a couple other women wanted to have a public conversation in a public library about how so-called gender identity is destroying the rights of women and girls. And I'm not kidding when I say that as we left, literally hundreds of people ran after us and threatened us.
Wow.
And, it's just astonishing. I literally know women who have lost their jobs because they speak up for the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls. And the tyranny of this is really destructive to civil society and to humanity.
And I think it speaks to how bad the idea is. Bad ideas have to be forced. Bad ideas have to come tyrannically. Bad ideas have to be bullied into the populace and have to, I think this executive order goes against popular opinion. I think it goes against what most people know is good and right and true for society. And yet, because of the tyrannical nature that you just described, because of the bullying sometimes of these lobbying groups, I think a lot of politicians and just private citizens are forced to conform. And like I said, it's not a good idea if it doesn't allow for the airing out of other ideas too. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for being willing to speak out, even when it's unpopular, even when it can feel dangerous at times. Can you tell people where they can find you and how they can support what you do?
Sure. Please visit womensdeclaration.com. check it out, see if you like it. If you like it, sign on to it. You also might want to check out the 11th Hour blog. That's the number 11, 11th Hour blog. This goes into extraordinary detail about the funding that is fueling this movement. And yeah, just check us out. There's actually a lot of information out there. It's just very difficult to find, but you can find it.
Yeah.
But go to womensdeclaration.com as a starting point.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.